Greetings everyone, I am EJM Batulan and I am one of the reporters for Chapter 5, and I was tasked to report the Parable of Talents, one of the literary work of Hebrew. Okay, so before we begin our discussion, let me ask you first a question. When you hear the term talent, what can you infer? We can commonly assume that a talent is something like an individual having the ability to dance, sing, or draw. However, for this instance, we will be using the word talent in a different context. Now, let us first begin with a definition of terms in order for us to be able to understand the terminologies used in this parable. The first word is parable. A parable is a simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. It was commonly told by Jesus in the Gospels. The next word is talent. The word talent originated from the Greek word talanton, which means scale and balance. It was used as a unit of weight of approximately 80 pounds. It is equivalent to 36 kilograms. And the term is used as a unit of money, which was valued for the unit or weight of the silver. Now let us move on to the summary of the parable of talents. So in the parable of talents, it describes a man who goes on a journey, entrusting his servants with his wealths and positions in his absence. Here, the master is entrusting his servants with a measure of his wealth, proportionate to each of their abilities. This was according to Matthew chapter 25 verse 15. To one servant, the master gives 5 talents. To a second servant, he gives 2 talents, and to the third servant, he gives 1 talent. The parable goes on to say that 2 of the servants, the one given 5 talents and the one handed 2, were good stewards of their master's money, investing it in such a way that when the master returned, they handed back double what he had originally given them. The third servant, however, was not so prudent. According to the story, the one who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. When the master eventually did return, the servants who were faithful were praised and entrusted with more of the master's wealth. The master said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." The servant who was fearful and negligent, however, was swiftly reprimanded by his master, who called him wicked, lazy, and worthless. His talent was taken and given to the one with 10 talents, and he himself was thrown out of his master's presence. Now let us move on to the analysis of the parable. The master of the parable is clearly meant to represent Jesus, the servants as Christ followers. Similar to the parable, Jesus has also given responsibility to his followers, and similar to the parable, he, the master, has promised to one day return. Before Jesus ascended into heaven, he told his disciples, "If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you with me, that you also may be where I am." This was according to John chapter 14 verse 3. But just because Jesus is physically absent from the earth doesn't mean that his followers are given the freedom to sit back and do nothing. Thus, this brings us to the moral lessons of the parable. First, the parable teaches us that success is a product of our work. Such work include spreading the gospel, forgiving those who wrong them, loving others, caring for his church, being an example to the world, feeding the hungry and thirsty, caring for the poor, the prisoner, the sick, or being hospitable to foreigners and outsiders. Second, the parable teaches us that God always gives us everything that we need to do what he has called us to do. According to Apostle Paul, he writes in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 10, "For we are God's handwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. The third lesson is that the parable teaches us that we are not all created equal. The fourth is that the parable of the talents teaches us that we work for the master, not for our own selfish purposes. Lastly, it teaches us that the parable of the talents shows that we will be held accountable for our actions. Just an additional and quick information. There are two versions of the parable. The first is based on the Gospel of Matthew, of which we have read earlier. The second is based on the Gospel of Luke, or also known as the Parable of Minas. However, one thing to note is that the difference between the two versions is only the settings. The setting of the parable of the talents of Matthew is the Mount Olivet discourse, while the setting of the parable of the minas in Luke was out in the opening among the crowd.